Hey everyone, welcome back to Beast History. Today we're diving into a story you think you know. It's a foundational American nightmare. The minute I say the words Salem Witch Trials, you see it right. Pointed black hats, hysterical accusers, grim-faced Puritans sending their neighbors to the gallows for dancing with the devil. It's a story we've told ourselves for centuries. A simple, terrifying fable about religious extremism run amok. But what if I told you that story is dangerously incomplete? What if the most terrifying monster in Salem wasn't the devil, but the mundane, ruthless demon of human greed? What if the real story, the one that drove a community to tear itself apart, wasn't about saving souls, but about settling scores, seizing land, and destroying your rivals? Because when you peel back the layers of religious panic, you find something far more familiar and, frankly, far more chilling. You find a story about money. You find a story about a brutal neighborhood dispute that escalated into a killing spree. This is the story of how land deeds, property lines, and simmering economic resentment became the kindling for a fire that consumed a town. Forget the devil in the woods. The real demons were in the account books, in the wills, and in the bitter hearts of neighbors who saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use paranoia as a weapon. To understand how a squabble over property could possibly end with 19 people hanging from a gallows, you have to understand the world they lived in. And let me tell you, 1692 Massachusetts was not a fun place to be. It was a pressure cooker, an outpost of anxiety on the ragged edge of the known world. Picture it. You're living in Salem Village. You are surrounded on all sides by what the Puritans called a howling wilderness. This isn't a quaint forest for a weekend hike. This is a vast, dark, impenetrable ocean of trees, hundreds of miles of it. And in that forest, there are things that can kill you. And not just bears or the brutal, soul-crushing New England winter that could freeze the marrow in your bones. There was a war on. This wasn't some distant conflict fought by armies on another continent. This was King William's War, a sprawling, brutal frontier war between English colonists and the French and their Native American allies, particularly the Wabanaki Confederacy. And the front line of that war was not some far-off place. It was a 20-minute walk from your house. Just 2 years before our story starts, in 1690, nearby settlements were devastated. Schenectady, New York, was wiped out in a bloody nighttime raid. Salmon Falls, New Hampshire, burned. Casco, Maine, was destroyed. Survivors, traumatized and destitute, streamed into Essex County, bringing with them horrific stories of violence, of neighbors killed and children taken captive. Imagine the psychological state of Salem Village. This wasn't abstract fear. It was a real, constant, low-grade terror. Every snapped twig in the woods at night, every shadow that moved at the edge of your property could be a threat. They were a community suffering from a collective case of post-traumatic stress disorder, living with the constant, gnawing anxiety that their entire world could be extinguished in a single night of fire and blood. They felt vulnerable, isolated, and utterly besieged. And when people feel that level of fear, they desperately look for a reason. They look for someone to blame. Now, layer on top of that physical fear the immense psychological weight of their religion. Being a Puritan wasn't just about going to church on Sunday and avoiding fun. It was a 24/7 high-stakes contract with the Almighty Himself. They called it the Covenant, and it was simple in a terrifying way. If you and your community were righteous, pious, and obedient to God's will, He would bless you. Your crops would grow, your children would be healthy, your enemies would be defeated. But if you sinned, if you allowed corruption and wickedness to fester in your community, God would withdraw His protection. He would punish you. And how would He punish you? With crop failure, with disease, and with brutal attacks from the wilderness. See the connection? When things started going horribly wrong, when the war was on their doorstep and their security was shattered, the Puritans didn't see it as a geopolitical conflict over colonial territory. They saw it as God's judgment. They saw it as proof that they had failed, that there was a rot somewhere inside their own community. They were primed, they were conditioned to look for an internal enemy. And for the Puritans, that enemy had a name and a face: Satan. The devil wasn't a metaphor for evil. He wasn't a philosophical concept. To the 17th century Puritan, the devil was a real, physical entity. He was a fallen angel, a powerful being who commanded legions of demons and who walked the earth with a singular mission: to tear down God's kingdom in the New World. They believed they were building a city upon a hill, a New Jerusalem, and the devil was doing everything in his power to sabotage it. His favorite tool: witches. He would tempt and recruit human beings, men and women, to sign his dark book, join his conspiracy, and carry out his evil work from within. Witchcraft wasn't superstition to them. It was treason. It was cosmic terrorism. It was the enemy within, working to destroy them on behalf of a dark power. This worldview, this profound and literal belief in an active devil, turned a fearful community into a paranoid one. They had the motive, a divine mandate to hunt for the source of their troubles. They just needed a target. And to find those targets, we have to zoom in on the specific local fault line that was cracking Salem apart long before any talk of witchcraft. The real conflict at the heart of our story isn't heaven versus hell. It's Salem town versus Salem village. Today, they're both just parts of Salem, but back then, they were two different worlds, locked in a bitter struggle. Salem town was the nexus of power. It was a bustling, prosperous port on the coast. Its windows faced the Atlantic. It was connected to Boston, to the Caribbean, to London. It was run by a growing class of wealthy merchants who were making serious money from trade, shipping, and the new world of Atlantic commerce. Think of it as the downtown, the financial district. This is where the money was, where the power was, and where a more cosmopolitan, commercially minded culture was taking root. Then there was Salem Village, 5 miles inland and a world away. If Salem town was the city, Salem Village was the struggling, resentful countryside. It was the sticks. The villagers were mostly subsistence farmers, living on land granted to their families generations before. They were poorer, more isolated, more traditional, and they were utterly dependent on Salem town. They were legally part of the town, which meant they had to pay taxes to Salem town, abide by its laws, and attend its church, but they had very little say in how things were run. They felt ignored, disenfranchised, and most importantly, economically exploited by the wealthy merchants in the town. It was a classic urban versus rural clash, a battle of old versus new, of agrarian tradition versus mercantile ambition. And for decades, the single greatest source of bitterness for Salem Village was their fight for independence. More than anything, they wanted their own church and their own minister. In the Puritan world, a church wasn't just a building. It was the heart of a community, the symbol of its identity and autonomy. To have your own church was to be your own town. But to get it, they had to constantly petition and beg Salem town, which held the purse strings and often seemed to drag its feet, enjoying its control over the upstart farmers. This struggle went on for years, creating deep wells of resentment and dividing the village itself into factions. There were those who wanted to break away completely, who hated the town and everything it represented. And there were those with business or family ties to the town who favored reconciliation and closer links. These factions were not new in 1692. They were old, deep, and personal. The community was already at war with itself. And into this simmering pot of paranoia, resentment, and division drops the perfect catalyst: a man named Reverend Samuel Parris. In 1689, after a long and contentious search, Salem Village finally hired its fourth minister. And Samuel Parris was, to put it mildly, an absolute disaster of a choice. He was not some beloved, charismatic spiritual leader destined to heal the community's wounds. Far from it. Parris was a man defined by failure and insecurity. He had started his career as a merchant in Barbados, where he had inherited a sugar plantation. But he was a bad businessman. He failed, sold the plantation, and moved back to Massachusetts to enter the ministry, which seems to have been his backup plan for a respectable career. He arrived in Salem Village with a massive chip on his shoulder. He was obsessed with status, with money, and with what he felt was the respect he was owed. His negotiations with the congregation were a sign of things to come. They were petty, acrimonious, and dragged on forever. He argued about his salary. He argued about who was responsible for providing his firewood, a crucial resource for survival in a New England winter. Most contentiously, he demanded that the village give him the deed to the ministry house itself, to own it outright. This was completely unheard of. The parsonage was community property for the use of the minister while he served. Paris wanted it as a personal asset. This immediately plunged the village into a nasty, public fight. A committee was formed, led by some of the most prominent men in the village, to oppose his demands. They refused to collect the taxes to pay his salary. They argued with him in public meetings. The village was torn apart over its own minister. On one side were Paris's supporters, the faction that was most strongly anti-Salem town and saw Paris as their champion of independence. On the other side were his opponents, a faction that had stronger ties to the town and saw Paris as a greedy, divisive grifter. Before a single person had a fit, before a single accusation was made, Reverend Samuel Paris, the man meant to be the spiritual shepherd of Salem Village, had become its single greatest source of conflict. He had taken a fractured community and driven a wedge right through its heart. He was a lit match looking for a fuse, and in the dead of winter in his own cold kitchen he found it. The year turns. It's now 1692. The setting is the Salem Village parsonage. It's January. The world outside is frozen solid, gray, and unforgiving. Inside the house, something strange and terrifying begins to happen. It starts with two young girls living under Paris's roof. His 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, known as Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. They begin to act bizarrely. They hide under furniture. They make strange, guttural, choking sounds. They complain of being pricked with pins, of being bitten. Then the episodes escalate. Their bodies contort into impossible shapes. They scream as if in agony. They have violent fits and fall into trance-like states. Paris is terrified. He's a minister, a man of God, and his own household seems to be under some kind of attack. He tries prayer, he tries fasting. Nothing works. The fits continue and they get worse. Soon, other girls in the village, friends of Betty and Abigail, begin to show the same horrifying symptoms. 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the village. Mercy Lewis, a 17-year-old servant in the Putnam household who had been orphaned by an Indian attack. Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, and others. A small group of teenage and preteen girls become the epicenter of this terrifying phenomenon. What was actually happening to them? It's the great, unanswerable question of Salem. For centuries, people have proposed theories. Ergotism, a poisoning from a rye fungus that can cause muscle spasms and hallucinations. Conversion disorder, a psychological condition where extreme stress manifests as physical symptoms. Some have even argued it was a form of post-traumatic stress, a reaction to the constant fear of war and attack. Or maybe, just maybe, it started as a prank, a game by bored, powerless girls that spiraled out of their control. We will never know for sure. But honestly, for our story, the medical cause doesn't matter. What matters is how the people of Salem interpreted it. A local physician, a Dr. Griggs, is called in. He examines the girls, and finding no physical cause for their ailments, he delivers a diagnosis that will change history. He declares the evil hand is upon them. It's not a disease, it's an affliction, it is witchcraft. That diagnosis was the spark falling into the tinderbox. The search was on. The community, led by a frantic Reverend Paris and other prominent villagers like Thomas Putnam, began to pressure the afflicted girls. Who is doing this to you? Who is tormenting you? Name the names. At first, the girls are silent, but the pressure mounts. Imagine being a young girl in that environment, the center of all this terrified adult attention. The fate of the entire community seems to rest on your shoulders. You have to provide an answer. And finally, they do. They name their tormentors. They name 3 women. And who they named is the most important clue in this entire mystery. They didn't name powerful people. They didn't name respected church members. They didn't name the wives or daughters of the village elite. They went for the lowest of the low. The most vulnerable, the most defenseless, the most disposable people in Salem Village. They named the perfect scapegoats. The first was Sarah Good. She was a homeless woman, a beggar who went from house to house asking for food, often muttering under her breath and being generally disagreeable when turned away. She was poor, she was disliked, and she was a constant, visible reminder of poverty and social failure. The second was Sarah Osborne. She was an elderly, bedridden woman who had been embroiled in a public scandal for years. She had tried to disinherit the children from her first marriage and keep control of their father's property for herself and her new husband, an Irish immigrant she had previously hired as a farmhand. This property dispute put her in direct conflict with one of the most powerful families in the village, the Putnams. And the third accused was perhaps the most vulnerable of all, Tituba. Tituba was an enslaved woman, owned by Reverend Samuel Paris himself. Her exact origins are murky. Paris had brought her with him from his failed plantation in Barbados. She was likely of South American or Caribbean indigenous descent, not African as she's often portrayed. To the white English Puritans of Salem, she was the ultimate outsider. A different race, a different culture, a slave. She had no status, no rights, no one to speak for her. Good, Osborne, and Tituba, a beggar, a recluse in a property dispute, and a slave. Not one of them had a husband, a father, or a brother in a position of power who would or could defend them. They were the perfect targets. Nobody would miss them. On February 29, 1692, arrest warrants were issued. The official, state-sanctioned hunt had begun. The local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, came from Salem town to conduct the initial examination. Hathorne, an ancestor of the writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, was the lead interrogator. And you have to understand, this wasn't a trial. It was a pre-trial hearing, but the assumption of guilt was baked in from the start. The examinations took place in the crowded meeting house. On one side, the magistrates. On the other, the accused women. And in the room, the afflicted girls, ready to provide the evidence. Sarah Good was first. She fiercely maintained her innocence, but her belligerent, angry demeanor did her no favors. Every time she spoke, the girls would writhe and scream, as if her voice alone was a physical assault. Then came Sarah Osborne, who also denied everything. But it was the examination of Tituba, over 3 long days, that blew the doors off the whole affair and turned a small local investigation into a full-blown panic. Tituba was in an impossible position. She was a slave, accused by her master's daughter. She was interrogated by powerful white men who were already convinced of her guilt. She had seen what happened to Good and Osborne when they denied the charges. The girls just screamed louder. She knew that in the Puritan system, defiance was seen as proof of guilt, a sign of the devil's pride. But confession offered a sliver of hope. In the Puritan mindset, a confessed witch was a sinner who had repented. They had renounced the devil and returned to God's side. They could become a source of information, a witness for the prosecution. A confessed witch might be saved. An unrepentant one would hang. We don't know for sure what happened in the hours she wasn't being publicly examined. Paris later admitted he may have used some form of chastisement to encourage her testimony. It's almost certain she was beaten. Trapped, terrified, and likely tortured, Tituba did the only rational thing a person in her irrational situation could do. She told them exactly what they wanted to hear, and she didn't just confess. She gave them a masterpiece. She gave them a narrative, drawing on a mix of English folklore, her own cultural traditions, and the leading questions of the magistrates. She spun a terrifying tale. She confessed that she had been approached by a tall man from Boston, a dark man who was the devil himself. He had tempted her, promised her pretty things. She said he made her sign his book, and there were other names in the book. 9 names in total. She had seen them. She said she had seen the specters of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne with him. She talked about riding on a stick through the air to demonic Sabbaths. She described a coven, a conspiracy of witches right there in Salem Village, working to torment the children and destroy the church. It was a bombshell. It was everything the magistrates and ministers feared, but it was also everything they secretly hoped for. It was validation. Their fears were not just paranoia, they were real. The war wasn't just on the frontier, it was right here in their homes. And Tituba's confession gave them a divine mandate to escalate. They weren't just looking for a few isolated, bitter old women anymore. They were now hunting for a secret army of the devil. They had a conspiracy to uncover. All they had to do was find the other names in that black book. The floodgates were open, and this all rests on the choice made by one terrified, enslaved woman. Tituba was trapped between 2 hells. If she maintained her innocence, she would be seen as a defiant witch, allied with the devil, and would almost certainly be condemned and executed. If she confessed, she would be lying, implicating others, and validating a hysteria she knew was false. But it was her only path to survival. Lie and live, or tell the truth and die. It's a brutal calculation. What would you have done in her position? Let me know in the comments. Tituba's confession was not just a confession, it was a blueprint. It was a business plan for a witch hunt. She had given the magistrates, the ministers, and the terrified public a story they could understand, a structure for their paranoia. Before her, they had a few isolated cases of mysterious torment. After her, they had a conspiracy. They had a coven, a black book signed in blood, a diabolical plot against all of God's people in Massachusetts. Her coerced testimony transformed the entire nature of the investigation. The job was no longer to figure out if there were witches. The job was to identify the rest of the conspirators she had mentioned. The hunt was on in earnest now, and it was about to get a whole lot bigger and a whole lot closer to home for the respectable folk of Essex County. The first wave of accusations had been easy. A beggar, a scandalous recluse, a slave. They were society's loose threads, easily snipped away. But now, with the validation of Tituba's confession, the afflicted girls grew bolder. The circle of accusation began to widen, and it started to creep up the social ladder. The first tremor that sent a shockwave of genuine fear through the pews of the Salem Village Church was the accusation of Martha Corey. Martha Corey was no Sarah Good. She was a respectable, land-owning woman, a full member of the church. But she had 2 fatal flaws in the world of 1692. First, she had a somewhat checkered past, having given birth to an illegitimate mixed-race son years earlier, a public sin that was never fully forgotten in a town with a long memory. Second, and far more dangerously, she was a skeptic. Martha Corey had made the disastrous mistake of thinking out loud. From the very beginning, she had been openly contemptuous of the girls' fits. She'd laughed at them. She had told her neighbors she didn't believe a word of it. She had even tried to stop her husband, Giles Corey, from attending the examinations. She saw the whole thing for the sham it was, and she said so. In a community gripped by mass hysteria, disbelief is not seen as rationality. It's seen as opposition. If you aren't with the righteous, you must be with the witches. Her skepticism was reframed as a guilty conscience. Of course she would say the girls are lying. She's one of the ones tormenting them. On March 12th, Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of the powerful Thomas Putnam, claimed the specter of Martha Corey had appeared to her. The trap was sprung. Martha's examination was a masterclass in the terrifying, circular logic of the trials. It was held in the village meeting house, packed to the rafters. Magistrate John Hathorne grilled her. "Why do you hurt these children?" he demanded. "I do not hurt them. I am an innocent woman," she insisted. And as she said it, the afflicted girls, a chorus of synchronized agony, shrieked and contorted. When Martha bit her lip, a nervous habit, the girls screamed that she was biting them, and they showed the magistrates tooth marks on their arms. When she wrung her hands in despair, they writhed on the floor, crying that she was squeezing their organs. Her every move, her every word, her every denial was instantly reinterpreted as an act of supernatural aggression. She had no defense. She was a fly caught in a spider's web, and her struggles only served to entangle her further. She was arrested and sent to jail. If the Martha Corey accusation was a shock, the next one was an earthquake. It was the accusation that should have stopped the entire process in its tracks. It was the moment the community had a choice to step back from the abyss, and instead chose to leap into it. They accused Rebecca Nurse. To understand what a stunning moment this was, you have to understand who Rebecca Nurse was. She was 71 years old. She was a grandmother, a matriarch of a large and well-respected family. Her reputation for piety and charity was sterling, beyond reproach. She was, by every conceivable measure, a living saint in the community. If you were casting a movie and needed someone to play godly Puritan woman, you would cast Rebecca Nurse. And on March 23rd, the afflicted girls, led by Ann Putnam Jr. and Abigail Williams, named her as one of their tormentors. The community was genuinely stunned. This couldn't be right. Goody Nurse, a witch. It seemed impossible. A petition was immediately drawn up and circulated, attesting to her good character. 39 of the most prominent members of the community signed it, a brave act of public defiance against the accusers. It was a direct challenge to the girls' credibility, but it was no use. The machine was now in motion, and it had a momentum all its own. Rebecca Nurse's examination was even more of a tragic farce than Martha Corey's. This frail, half-deaf 71-year-old woman stood before the magistrates, utterly bewildered. "I am as innocent as the child unborn," she said, her voice trembling. But every time she would lean her head to her shoulder, the afflicted girls' heads would hang limp. When she spread her hands, they would scream that she was pushing them over. At one point during the chaos, Hathorne saw the girls convulse and asked, "What is it?" One of them cried out, "Goody Nurse has been talking to a black man, a great devil." The charge was now public. Rebecca Nurse, the pillar of the community, was in league with Satan. She too was carted off to jail. The message was now chillingly, terrifyingly clear. If they could come for Rebecca Nurse, they could come for anyone. No amount of piety, no lifetime of good deeds could protect you. The fire was spreading. So why them? Why these respected church members? Was it random, just hysterical girls pointing fingers? Not a chance. To understand the deliberate, targeted nature of these accusations, we have to pull back and look at the real power players operating in the shadows. This is where the story of faith and fear becomes a brutal story of politics and land. This is the story of two families, the Putnams and the Porters. Think of them as the two rival mafia families of Salem Village. They were the two most powerful dynasties, and they were locked in a decades-long struggle for control of the village's soul and its wallet. First, let's talk about the accusers-in-chief, the Putnam family. They were led by Sergeant Thomas Putnam Jr. The Putnams were old money, at least by American standards. They were one of the founding families of Salem Village. Their patriarch had been one of the original land grantees. But by 1692, their star was fading. The family land had been divided among too many sons. Their farms were getting smaller, and their relative wealth and influence were being eclipsed by newer, more commercially savvy families. Thomas Putnam was a man staring at a future of diminished prestige. He was proud, bitter, and desperate to reclaim his family's top dog status. And he saw his chance in the religious and political turmoil of the village. He was the fiercest advocate for the village's independence from Salem town, and he was the primary backer and ally of the divisive Reverend Samuel Parris. Thomas Putnam didn't get his hands dirty directly. He had a secret weapon. In fact, he had two: his wife, Ann Putnam Sr., and his 12-year-old daughter, Ann Putnam Jr. These two women would become the engine of the Salem Witch Trials. Ann Sr. was a troubled woman, haunted by the deaths of several of her infants, and she quickly began to claim that she too was being attacked by specters. But it was young Ann Jr. who became the star witness, the most prolific and convincing of all the afflicted girls. Between them, the Putnam women would be involved in accusing more than 60 people. And here is where the money trail gets hot. When you take the list of people accused by the Putnams and lay it over a map of Salem Village and a record of its disputes, a stunning pattern emerges. The people they accused were not random. Again and again, they were people with whom the Putnam family had documented long-standing grievances. Rebecca Nurse. The Nurse family had been in a bitter, multi-year land dispute with the Putnams over the boundary of their farms. Sarah Osborne, one of the first three accused. She was the widow who had tried to cut her sons out of their inheritance, sons who were the nephews of Thomas Putnam. Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister who would later be accused of being the witch's ringleader. He had borrowed money from Thomas Putnam and had been unable to pay it back, leading to a nasty and public falling out. Time after time, the pattern held. People who had crossed the Putnams in business, in court, or in politics suddenly found themselves facing a capital charge of witchcraft, with Thomas Putnam himself often signing the official complaint, and his daughter providing the spectral evidence. It was a brilliant, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective way to eliminate your enemies. On the other side of this feud were the Porters. Led by John Porter and his brother Israel, the Porters represented everything the Putnams were not. They were new money. Their wealth wasn't just in land, it was in commerce. They had built sawmills and grist mills, they owned ships, and they had extensive business dealings in Salem town and beyond. They were the face of the new mercantile economy that was making the Putnams' agrarian world obsolete. Politically, they were the leaders of the faction that opposed the village's independence. They wanted stronger ties to Salem town, where their real interests lay. And crucially, they had led the opposition against the hiring of Reverend Parris, the Putnams' hand-picked minister. The battle lines were clearly drawn: Putnams versus Porters, the agrarian past versus the commercial future, the village separatists versus the town loyalists, and the witch hunt became a proxy war for this conflict. If you look at who opposed the trials, who spoke out against the accusers, who signed the petition for Rebecca Nurse, you find the names of the Porter family and their allies over and over again. And if you look at who was being accused, you find the enemies of the Putnams and Reverend Parris. The witch trials weren't just a religious event. They were a political purge, orchestrated by a declining dynasty to reclaim power and settle old scores. But how could such a transparently self-serving campaign possibly succeed? How could it be given the stamp of legal authority? To answer that, you have to look at the legal machinery itself, a system so flawed it seemed perfectly designed to produce wrongful convictions. The preliminary examinations were conducted by two magistrates from Salem town, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. Hathorne, in particular, was the driving force. You should not picture him as some cackling, mustache-twirling villain. Picture him as a severe, humorless, and profoundly self-righteous bureaucrat. He was absolutely convinced of the reality of the demonic conspiracy and saw it as his holy duty to root it out. His style of questioning was not that of an impartial investigator. It was the questioning of a prosecutor who had already decided on the verdict. Are you not guilty? Why do you torment these poor children? The presumption of guilt was the starting point for every conversation. The examinations themselves were pure theater. They were often held in Ingersoll's Tavern, a crowded, stifling public house. The magistrates would sit at a table. The accused, without a lawyer, without any counsel, stood before them. And all around them, the afflicted girls were waiting for their cue. The entire process was built on a single, catastrophic legal concept, the doctrine of spectral evidence. Here's how it worked. The afflicted girls would claim that they were being tormented not by the physical body of the accused, but by their specter, their spirit shape, their apparition. They would testify that the ghost of, say, Martha Corey flew into their room at night and pinched them, or sat on their chest to suffocate them. The problem, by its very definition, this evidence was invisible to everyone except the accuser. It was a private experience. So, when an accused person stood before the court and said, "I was at home in my bed all night," it was no defense. The magistrates would say, "We are not saying your body was there. We are saying your spirit was there, tormenting these girls." How do you possibly defend yourself against that? How do you prove where your ghost wasn't on a Tuesday night? It's an unfalsifiable claim. It is literally impossible to disprove. The system was a closed loop of logic. The magistrates would ask a leading question. The girls would perform the corresponding torment. And this performance would be taken as proof that the magistrate's suspicion was correct. The accused person's denials were seen as lies, which only proved their heart was hardened by the devil. Any sign of distress, a twitch, a sigh, a glance, was interpreted as a supernatural attack. The examinations were not legal proceedings. They were rituals of public shaming designed to produce confessions. And with jails now overflowing with accused witches from Salem, from Topsfield, from Andover, the colonial government in Boston knew it had a crisis on its hands. It was time for real trials. It was time for executions. The point of no return came on June 2nd, 1692. The first person to be brought to trial and convicted was a woman named Bridget Bishop. Bishop was the perfect first victim. She was an outsider who checked all the boxes for a stereotypical witch. She was a tavern keeper, which already made her a morally suspect figure in a Puritan community. She was known for quarreling publicly with her husbands, and most damningly, she liked to wear a red bodice. This flash of color, this small act of nonconformity, was seen as a sign of her vanity and worldliness. She was also not a stranger to this kind of accusation. She had been accused of witchcraft years earlier, in 1680, but had been acquitted. This time, she would not be so lucky. Her trial was a parade of flimsy evidence and local gossip. A man testified that her specter had visited his bedroom 13 years prior. Others recounted stories of how their horses would mysteriously balk or their carts would get stuck after an argument with her. The most damning physical evidence came from a group of men who claimed to have found poppets in the walls of her old house, small dolls stuck with pins, the classic tools of witchcraft. The fact that Bishop hadn't lived in that house for years didn't seem to matter. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was taken to a barren rise of land just outside Salem town, a place that would come to be known as Gallows Hill. There she was hanged. Her death marked a terrifying new phase. The state had now officially sanctioned the killings. The path from accusation to execution was now clear, tested, and proven. The fear that had been simmering for months now had the grim, tangible reality of a corpse swinging from a rope. The hunt was about to enter its bloodiest phase, and in this escalating madness, we find our tragic hero. A man who saw the insanity for what it was, who dared to speak out, and who would pay the ultimate price for it. His name was John Proctor. Proctor was not one of the Salem Village insiders. He was a successful and prosperous farmer and tavern keeper who lived on the outskirts, closer to Ipswich. He was 60 years old, powerful in stature, and known for his loud, blunt, and often profane speech. He was not a man who suffered fools gladly, and from the very beginning he thought the entire witch hunt was a scam. He openly scoffed at the proceedings. He called the afflicted girls liars and frauds, suggesting they should be whipped for their deceptions. This kind of talk was incredibly dangerous. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the magistrates and the entire narrative they were building. Proctor's biggest mistake, however, was that the contagion was inside his own house. His own servant girl, a young woman named Mary Warren, was one of the original circle of afflicted girls. When the hysteria began, Proctor, in his no-nonsense way, put a stop to it. He told Mary that if she had any more fits, he would beat her until she came to her senses. He put her to work spinning on the wheel, believing that hard labor was the best cure for her fantasies. And it worked. For a while, Mary Warren was quiet, but the social pressure on her must have been immense. Her friends were now celebrities, the center of the universe, holding the power of life and death in their hands. Mary was caught between the terrifying power of her master, John Proctor, and the intoxicating power of the other girls. In early April, she rejoined the circle. The magistrates, knowing of Proctor's skepticism, began to question her. Who was making her have fits now? Mary Warren, trapped and terrified, made her choice. She buckled, and she pointed the finger not only at her master, John Proctor, but also at his pregnant wife, Elizabeth. It was a brutal act of self-preservation, turning on the very people who had sheltered her. On April 11th, the constables came for them. John Proctor, the proud, defiant skeptic, the man who believed in common sense, was arrested for witchcraft, along with his wife. He was about to learn firsthand that in the courtroom of Salem, common sense was a heresy, and the truth was no defense at all. His fight for his life, and the life of his family, had just begun. The arrest of John Proctor was a chilling demonstration of a new rule in Salem's brutal game. Silence was safety, but defiance was a death sentence. By openly calling the accusers frauds, Proctor hadn't just made himself a target. He had challenged the very legitimacy of the entire proceeding. And the powerful men running the show, the Putnams and their allies, could not let that challenge stand. They had to make an example of him. His story, and the stories of those who would be tried alongside him, marks the peak of the madness. The bloody, feverish summer of 1692, when the witch-hunting machine, now fully assembled, began to operate with ruthless efficiency. The jails in Salem, Ipswich, and Boston were overflowing. They were miserable, dark, foul-smelling places, more like dungeons than modern prisons. The accused were packed together in squalor, often bound in chains and shackles which their families were forced to pay for. They were living in a legal limbo. They had been examined and charged, but there was no official, high-level court with the authority to actually try and execute them for a capital crime like witchcraft. The colony of Massachusetts was in a state of political turmoil itself. Its original charter had been revoked by the English crown years earlier, leaving it without a stable, legal government. It was, in effect, a failed state. But in May of 1692, a ship from England arrived in Boston Harbor. On board was the new royally appointed governor, Sir William Phips. Phips was a man of action, a Massachusetts native who had made a fortune as a treasure hunter, famously salvaging a Spanish galleon laden with silver. He was not a legal scholar or a theologian. He was a practical man, and when he arrived, he found his colony in chaos. The northern frontier was being savaged by war, and the eastern counties were paralyzed by a witchcraft panic. He needed to impose order, and he needed to do it fast. So he made a decision that would seal the fate of dozens. Without waiting for guidance from London, and with the apathetic consent of his council, Phips established a special court to hear and determine the witchcraft cases. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, and to lead it he appointed his lieutenant governor, a man named William Stoughton, as the chief magistrate. And William Stoughton is one of the true villains of this story. He was not a conflicted man. He was not a man troubled by doubt. Stoughton was a Harvard-educated aristocrat, a wealthy landowner, and a political hardliner. He was utterly, unshakably convinced that a diabolical conspiracy was threatening to destroy Massachusetts. He was also a staunch believer in the validity of spectral evidence. For Stoughton, the fits and screams of the afflicted girls were not just evidence, they were gospel truth, a direct window into the spiritual world. He saw his mission as a holy one, to purge the land of the devil's servants quickly and without mercy. The court of Oyer and Terminer under his leadership was not an instrument of justice. It was an execution machine, and it was about to go into overdrive. The court convened in early June. Bridget Bishop was its first customer, tried, convicted, and hanged within 8 days. Then the court took a short break. When it reconvened on June 28th, the pace quickened dramatically. 5 more women were tried and condemned. In August, another 5, including John Proctor. In September, a staggering 15 more were sentenced to death. Stoughton's court was ruthlessly efficient, a conveyor belt from the jailhouse to the gallows. And one of the most dramatic and telling trials of that summer was the case against the Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs's trial is a perfect case study in how personal grudges and financial disputes were laundered through the court and transformed into demonic conspiracies. Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village, having served there from 1680 to 1683, and his tenure had been a disaster. He had clashed repeatedly with the community over his salary, and he had found himself on the wrong side of the powerful Putnam family. He had borrowed money from Sergeant Thomas Putnam to pay for his wife's funeral, and a bitter dispute arose over the repayment. Burroughs, fed up with the village's infighting, had eventually left town, leaving the debt unresolved. In the minds of the Putnams, he was not just a bad minister or a financial deadbeat. He was an enemy. And now, years later, they had their chance for revenge. The afflicted girls, led by Ann Putnam Jr. and the servant Mercy Lewis, who had once worked for Burroughs, began to name him. But they didn't just accuse him of witchcraft. They accused him of being the master, the leader, the ringleader of all the witches in New England. They claimed he was the dark pope of this demonic conspiracy, the one who organized their Sabbaths and directed their attacks. Burroughs was arrested in Maine, where he was now serving as a minister, and dragged back to Salem in chains to stand trial. The evidence against him was a surreal collection of rumor and fantasy. The core of the accusation was that he possessed superhuman strength, a supposed gift from the devil. Several men, all connected to the Putnam faction, testified that he could lift a musket barrel with just one finger, or carry impossibly heavy barrels of molasses. His very masculinity and physical prowess were turned against him, twisted into something diabolical. But the climax of the George Burroughs story, the moment that reveals the terrifying power of the authorities, came at his execution on August 19th. Standing on the ladder with the noose around his neck, this supposed general of the devil's army did something astonishing. He began to speak to the crowd, and he recited the Lord's Prayer from beginning to end without a single error, without a single hesitation. The crowd was stunned into silence. It was a universally held belief at the time that a witch, a true servant of the devil, was physically incapable of reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly. Burroughs had, just in the eyes of everyone present, proven his innocence at the last possible second. The crowd began to stir. Murmurs turned to shouts. People began to feel that an innocent man was about to be killed. A riot seemed imminent. Then another figure on horseback pushed through the crowd. It was the Reverend Cotton Mather, one of Boston's most influential ministers and a vocal supporter of the trials. Seeing that he was about to lose control of the situation, Mather addressed the crowd. He reminded them that Burroughs was not an ordained minister in their eyes, and most chillingly, he declared that the devil himself could appear as an angel of light. He argued that Burroughs's perfect recitation was not proof of his innocence, but the ultimate trick of the devil, a final, deceptive performance to sow doubt and save his chief agent. It was enough. The crowd's conviction wavered. The authorities regained control. The ladder was kicked away and George Burroughs was hanged. The moment reveals the unbreachable fortress of the accuser's logic. Evidence of innocence was twisted into further proof of guilt. There was no way out, and as the bodies piled up on Gallows Hill, there was another, colder calculation at play. This brings us back to the core of our story, the economics of accusation. Because getting accused of witchcraft in 1692 didn't just put your soul in peril, it put your family into immediate and catastrophic financial ruin. Here's how the system worked, and it was brutal. The moment a warrant was issued for your arrest, the local sheriff had the right to seize your personal property, your movable goods. This wasn't a fine levied after conviction. It happened immediately upon accusation. The sheriff and his deputies would descend on your farm and take your livestock, your cows, your pigs, your oxen. They would take your furniture. They would take the crops from your field and the food from your larder. This was all done, of course, long before you had been proven guilty of anything. It was justified as a way to ensure the accused wouldn't flee, and that there would be assets available to pay for their incarceration. Because you had to pay for everything. You had to pay for your own imprisonment. The families of the accused were billed for their food, their water, their bedding, and even for the chains and shackles they were forced to wear. The jailer's fees were a constant, draining expense. So from day one, an accusation meant financial devastation. Your ability to make a living was destroyed, your assets were confiscated, and your family was being bled dry by fees. Now, did people like Thomas Putnam get rich by directly accusing their neighbors and then scooping up their land? The direct evidence for that kind of overt conspiracy is thin. It wasn't quite that simple, but the system itself created a powerful, perverse incentive. Accusing a business rival or someone you were in a land dispute with was a surefire way to neutralize them. Even if they were eventually acquitted, they would likely be financially ruined in the process. The accusation itself was the weapon. It allowed you to use the power of the state to bankrupt your enemies. We see this clearly in the case of John Proctor. He was a wealthy man. The inventory of the goods seized from his home by the sheriff is staggering. It lists dozens of cattle, pigs, and sheep, multiple feather beds, furniture, pewter dishes, and barrels of cider. His wife, Elizabeth, even had to petition the court from prison, begging for some of her property back, complaining that the sheriff had left us nothing to support ourselves with. For the Proctor family and many others, the financial sentence was handed down long before the legal one. The system ensured that even if you survived the gallows, you would emerge a broken and impoverished person. It was a way to reshuffle the economic deck of the community, using the courts as the dealer. For month after blood-soaked month, through the summer of 1692, this machine ground on, chewing up the lives and fortunes of anyone who got caught in its gears. But like all revolutions, like all reigns of terror, the Salem Panic eventually began to devour its own. The accusers, emboldened by their unchecked power, started to overreach. The accusations, which had started with outcasts and then moved to respectable farmers and their wives, began to creep higher and higher up the social and political ladder. The girls started naming people in other towns, like Andover, where a local justice of the peace essentially invited the Salem girls to come and start a witch hunt to explain a local sickness. The accusations became more and more reckless. They accused wealthy Boston merchants. They accused prominent, well-connected individuals who had powerful friends. They accused other ministers. They even accused some of the political rivals of Chief Magistrate William Stoughton. And then they made their fatal, final mistake. They flew too close to the sun. In the fall of 1692, an accusation was reportedly made against Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself. Another rumor circulated that the accusers had their eyes on the wife of the Reverend Increase Mather, the powerful president of Harvard College. Suddenly, the game had changed. This was the turning point. as long as the accused were poor farmers from the backwater of Salem Village, or troublesome women like Bridget Bishop. The Boston elite who ran the colony were willing to let the trials proceed. It was a convenient way to deal with a messy local problem and show that they were serious about moral order. But now, the fire was no longer contained to the countryside. It was licking at the doorsteps of their own mansions in Boston. The madness they had unleashed to purge the lower orders was now threatening their own class, their own families. The abstract, theological problem of witchcraft had suddenly become a very real political and personal threat to the people in charge, and their perspectives shifted with astonishing speed. As the political elite began to panic, a powerful intellectual counterattack was already taking shape, and it was being led by the most influential Puritan of his generation, Reverend Increase Mather. Now, it's important to understand, Mather was not a modern skeptic. He was Cotton Mather's father, and like his son, he absolutely believed in the existence of witches and the reality of the devil's plot. But he was also a rigorous intellectual, and he was horrified not by the goal of the trials, but by the methods. He was appalled by the court's total reliance on spectral evidence. In early October, Mather delivered a sermon to an assembly of ministers that would be published under the title, Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. It was a methodical, brilliant, and devastating takedown of the legal foundation of the Salem court. He argued that the devil was a liar and a trickster. He could send a specter in the shape of an innocent person to torment someone, precisely to trick gullible judges into condemning the innocent. Therefore, he argued, spectral evidence was unreliable, contaminated, and should never be used as the sole basis for a conviction. He laid down a new standard, a phrase that would echo through the history of American jurisprudence. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. Mather's sermon was a theological earthquake. He was the president of Harvard, the most respected minister in New England. He wasn't saying the accused were innocent. He was saying the court couldn't prove they were guilty. And this gave Governor Phipps the exact intellectual and theological cover he so desperately needed. His own wife was now being targeted. The most powerful minister in the colony was now publicly questioning the court's legal basis. The political winds had changed direction. On October 29, 1692, Governor Phipps acted. He ordered a halt to the proceedings. He forbade any more arrests, and most importantly, he officially dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. William Stoughton's killing machine was shut down. For the 19 people who had been hanged, for Giles Corey, who had been pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea, and for the several others who had died in the filthy jails, it was too late. But for the dozens more still awaiting trial, it was a reprieve. The peak of the madness was over. Governor Phipps finally steps in and dissolves the court of Oyer and Terminer, but only after 19 people had been hanged, several more had died in prison, and his own wife was accused. He had the authority to intervene months earlier. So, was his decision a true crisis of conscience, a moment of moral awakening spurred by thinkers like Increase Mather? Or was it a cynical political calculation to save himself and his allies once the fire got too close? A courageous leader or a self-interested politician? I'm genuinely curious to hear what you guys think. The shutdown of the court of Oyer and Terminer was like flipping a switch. The inferno that had raged for 9 months was, almost instantly, extinguished. Governor Phipps's order didn't just end the trials. It shattered the psychological spell that had held the colony in its grip. The suspension of the court was a public, official admission that something had gone horribly, catastrophically wrong. The legal and moral authority that had propped up the entire affair had evaporated overnight. But the crisis wasn't over. The jails were still full of accused witches, many of them already condemned and awaiting their turn at the gallows. Governor Phipps, now fully engaged in damage control, established a new court to deal with the remaining cases, the Superior Court of Judicature. But this new court had one critical, game-changing new rule handed down by the governor himself. Spectral evidence was no longer admissible. The court could no longer convict someone based on the ghostly testimony of the afflicted girls. It was a legal revolution. The results were immediate and staggering. The new court began hearing cases in January of 1693, and the verdicts tell the whole story. Of the 52 remaining cases brought before the Superior Court, 49 ended in acquittal. There simply was no other credible evidence. The entire legal machine, the whole deadly enterprise, had been running on the fuel of spectral testimony. Once that fuel was taken away, the engine sputtered and died. The few who were condemned by the new court, largely because they had confessed under duress months earlier, were swiftly granted pardons by Governor Phipps. Chief Justice William Stoughton, furious at this executive intervention, briefly resigned in protest, but the tide had turned against him. He was a general without an army. By the spring of 1693, the panic was over. The governor issued a general pardon for everyone still in jail or under suspicion. The accused, many of them having languished in chains for the better part of a year, were finally allowed to go free. But freedom did not mean a return to normal. They limped back not to the lives they had known, but to the wreckage. They returned to farms that had been looted, to businesses that had failed, to savings that had been wiped out by jail fees. And they returned to a community that had to somehow live with itself, a community of victims and perpetrators, of accusers and accused, who were still neighbors and would have to see each other every single day at the market, on the road, and in the church. The phase of retribution was over. The long, slow, painful phase of reckoning had begun. What followed in the years after 1692 was a remarkable, and for its time, almost unprecedented period of public soul-searching and repentance. The Puritans had committed a terrible sin, and they knew it. They had shed innocent blood, a profound violation of their covenant with God, and they lived in fear of divine punishment. This led to some of the most extraordinary public apologies in American history. One of the first and most powerful came from a man at the very heart of the machine, Samuel Sewall. Sewall was a wealthy Boston merchant and one of the 9 judges who had sat on Stoughton's court of oyer and terminer. He had listened to the spectral evidence and had sent innocent people to their deaths. But unlike the unrepentant Stoughton, Sewall was haunted by what he had done. He became convinced that the personal tragedies that befell his family in the years after the trials, the deaths of several of his children, were God's judgment upon him for his role in the killings. So on January 14th, 1697, a day of public fasting and prayer was declared across the colony to atone for the tragedy. On that day, Samuel Sewall stood up in the middle of Boston's packed Old South Church. He was a proud, wealthy, powerful man, a pillar of the establishment. He handed a written confession to his minister, who then read it aloud to the stunned congregation. Sewall himself stood silent before them, his head bowed. In the confession, he accepted the blame and shame of the Salem tragedy, admitting he had been misguided and mistaken. He begged for forgiveness from both God and man for his role in condemning those who died as a result of the sentence of that court. It was a stunning act of public humility from a man of his stature, an acknowledgement that the system itself had failed. The judges were not the only ones to repent. In that same year, 12 of the jurors who had served on the Salem trial juries signed their own public letter of apology. They were ordinary men, farmers and artisans who had been swept up in the hysteria. They now declared that they had been sadly deluded and mistaken in their judgments. They confessed their fear that they had brought upon themselves and the community the guilt of innocent blood. They begged forgiveness from the survivors and acknowledged the profound damage they had done to the families of the victims. But perhaps the most chilling and significant apology of all came 9 years later, in 1706. It came from the person who was, arguably, the single most important human engine of the entire affair. Ann Putnam Jr. She had been the 12-year-old girl at the center of the storm, the leader of the afflicted children, the star witness whose spectral torments had condemned so many. Now, she was a young woman in her mid-20s. Her parents, Thomas and Ann Putnam Sr., were both dead. She was left alone to care for her many younger siblings. Her health was poor. She was an orphan, living with the ghosts of what she had done. And so she stood before the Salem village congregation, the very church her accusations had torn apart, and had her pastor read her confession aloud. In it, she claimed that she had not acted out of anger, malice, or ill will. Instead, she said she had been deluded by Satan, who had used her as an instrument to bring about his dark designs. And then she named names, but this time in apology. She spoke specifically of Rebecca Nurse, begging forgiveness for her role in the death of such a good person. It is the closest thing we have to a confession from any of the accusers. Was it a genuine act of remorse? A calculated attempt to rejoin a community that had begun to ostracize her? A desperate attempt to explain to herself the horrors she had unleashed as a child? We can't know for sure, but it stands as a haunting final chapter in the story of the afflicted girls. While the community was wrestling with its moral conscience, it also had to deal with the material consequences. The fight for justice became a fight for financial restitution. This is where the money story comes full circle. For years, the survivors of the trials and the families of the executed petitioned the Massachusetts government. They wanted two things. First, they wanted the government to reverse the attainder on their loved ones. Attainder was a form of civil death. When you were convicted of a felony like witchcraft, you not only lost your life, but you also lost all your civil rights, including the right to pass down property to your heirs. The families wanted their names legally cleared so they could reclaim their standing and their property. Second, they wanted financial compensation for the goods that had been seized and the economic ruin they had suffered. This was a long and difficult fight, mired in politics. But finally, in 1711, the Massachusetts General Court passed a bill that officially reversed the convictions of 22 of the victims and offered a lump sum of £578 to be divided among the petitioners. The process of dividing up that money is a final, fascinating window into the old politics of Salem. A committee was formed, led by none other than John Porter, the old rival of the Putnam family. The claims submitted by the families provide a heartbreaking accounting of the true cost of the trials. John Proctor's son, Abraham, submitted a detailed claim not just for the dozens of livestock seized, but for the loss of business at their tavern and the immense fees they had to pay. The family of George Burroughs detailed the poverty his orphaned children had been left in. The family of Sarah Good, the destitute beggar, received a paltry sum. The list of payments is a final tally of the human and economic devastation. The amounts were small, nowhere near enough to truly compensate for the loss of life, property, and reputation. But it was a final, official acknowledgement that the state itself was responsible for the tragedy. So what happened to the key players in our drama? The architects of the panic mostly faded into obscurity, their legacies forever stained. Reverend Samuel Parris, the insecure and greedy minister who lit the initial fuse, never recovered. His opponents in the village, led by the Nurse family, waged a relentless campaign against him for years after the trials. They brought charges against him in the church. They refused to pay his salary, and they made his life a living hell. In 1697, he was finally forced out of Salem Village, a disgraced and broken man. He died in obscurity a few years later. The Putnam family, the great puppet masters of the accusations, saw their influence in the village wither. While they never faced legal consequences, their moral authority was shattered. The trials that were meant to restore their family's dominance ended up being the cause of its ultimate decline. Their great rivals, the Porter family and the anti-Paris faction they led, largely won the political war for control of the village in the long run. But it was a victory won at an almost unimaginable cost. John Proctor's name was cleared. His attainder was reversed, and his family received one of the largest settlements from the government, £150, a testament to the wealth he had lost. His pregnant wife, Elizabeth, who had been spared execution because of her condition, was eventually released from prison, gave birth to a son she named John, and later remarried, finding some measure of peace after her ordeal. And Tituba, the enslaved woman whose coerced confession had turned a spark into a wildfire, she was never tried. As a confessed witch who had become a witness for the state, she was protected from the gallows. But she languished in the Boston jail for over a year because her owner, Reverend Paris, refused to pay her jail fees. He had no more use for her. In the end, she was sold to an unknown buyer for the price of her fees, and she disappears completely from the historical record, a final, tragic testament to her status as a disposable person in this story. So, was the story of the Salem Witch Trials really about money? The answer is yes, but not only about money. To say it was just about land disputes is as simplistic as saying it was just about religious fanaticism. The horror of Salem lies in the fact that it was a perfect storm, a tragedy that required a fatal intersection of multiple causes. You can think of it like building a fire. The pre-existing conditions, the decades of bitter land disputes, the economic anxiety of the farmers, the social rivalry between the Putnams and the Porters. That was the dry timber and the kindling. It was the fuel lying there waiting for a spark. The rigid, all-encompassing Puritan belief system, their literal fear of a real, active devil and his conspiracy to overthrow them. That was the gasoline poured liberally over all of that dry wood. It created a world where accusing your neighbor of witchcraft was a plausible, even a righteous, thing to do. The political instability of the colony, the lack of a legal charter and the trauma of the frontier wars, that was the absence of a fire department. There was no stable authority to step in and put out the blaze before it got out of control. And the mysterious, inexplicable fits of a few young girls in the dead of winter, that was the match. The single, tiny spark that ignited the entire inferno. If you remove any one of those elements, the tragedy of 1692 probably doesn't happen. Without the economic grievances, the accusations might never have had such specific, powerful targets. Without the religious terror, those grievances would have remained just local squabbles, ending in lawsuits, not on the gallows. And without the political vacuum, a stable government might have intervened much sooner, dismissing the spectral evidence and stopping the madness in its tracks. It was the combination of all these forces, money, faith, and fear, all swirling together in the pressure cooker of a small, isolated village, that created the unique and horrifying chemistry of Salem. The legacy of Salem is woven deep into the American identity. It became a foundational story, a cautionary tale that we tell ourselves over and over again. Legally, it had a profound impact. The spectacular failure of the court of Oyer and Terminer, and its reliance on spectral evidence, helped burn the principle of innocent until proven guilty into the American legal consciousness. The idea that the burden of proof is on the accuser, not the accused, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, became a cornerstone of our justice system. Culturally, of course, Salem became a powerful and enduring metaphor. It's our go-to shorthand for any instance of mass hysteria and political persecution. In the 1950s, the playwright Arthur Miller used the story of the Salem trials as a direct allegory for the anti-communist witch hunts of the McCarthy era. His play, The Crucible, cemented the story in the minds of millions as a timeless drama about the dangers of intolerance and the moral courage of the individual standing against a mindless mob. In the end, the story of Salem is a stark reminder of a dark and timeless truth. The specific belief in black magic and demonic pacts may seem like a relic of a distant, superstitious past, but the underlying human dynamics are eternal. The fear of the other, the desperate need to find a scapegoat for our problems, the intoxicating power of moral certainty, and the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can be convinced to do monstrous things in the name of a righteous cause. And most chillingly, the way that greed and personal animosity can put on the mask of public service, weaponizing paranoia to settle old scores. The monsters of Salem were not supernatural. They were profoundly, terrifyingly human. And that's where the story of the Salem Witch Trials comes to its dramatic close. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Beast History so you don't miss what's next. We've got so many more insane stories ready for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.